The 1980s were the definitive decade of the hot hatch, and in Britain at least that meant 205 and 309 GTIs, MG Metros and MG Maestros, and Fiesta XR2s and Escort XR3s. But let's say for a minute that you needed a family car, or you were pretty successful in your sales job and you didn't want to surrender to the dullness of a GL trim level. Well, for a fleeting couple of years, you might have chosen a rather forgotten fast Ford, the Sierra XR4i. Ahead of getting into things, this car can be found at Manor Park Classics, so if you fancy thrashing about in a hot jelly mould, then please do follow the link in the description. But the Sierra as a whole was something pretty radical for Ford of Europe in the 1980s, so before getting lost in all the hot hatch lore, we're going to need a bit of a history lesson. The Ford Motor Company has led at least a slice of British manufacturing since 1911, but even considering their world-storming Model T, it took them until the beginning of the 1960s for them to approach the pinnacle of the British sales charts. You see, Ford of Britain was essentially an independent company at this point, and their philosophy was one of total minimalism. For example, the 100e Ford Anglia was launched in 1953, and this was an all-new car featuring unitary construction and McPherson strut front suspension. That was all relatively modern for the period, but what was not included a side valve engine, a 3-speed gearbox, and vacuum-operated windscreen wipers, meaning they stopped if you dared to climb a hill. To round things off, it was clothed in a frumpy, almost funereal body, with headlamps looking as though the little fella needed a good sleep. Now don't get me wrong, Ford were successful in Britain, but they couldn't get near the likes of the Morris Minor with a product that failed to inspire, and the answer to their prayers came in 1959 with the launch of the Anglia 105e. The headline is, of course, the styling, aping Hillman and Vauxhall in bringing a sense of American excess to little old Britain. But unlike the cars from Brighton and Luton, the Anglia was downright rakish, and even if it dated quickly, it made an immediate statement. Beneath the style, however, was componentry that could finally challenge and even defeat the competition. In were electric wipers and a 4-speed gearbox, as well as the now legendary overhead valve Kent engine. This little 4-cylinder doesn't look like much, but it proved to be bulletproof and featured a short stroke, meaning it thrived on revs, endearing it to racers and constructors alike, appearing in small Fords all the way through to 2004. The 105e was the catalyst for everything that came later. As though it never topped the sales charts itself, it transformed the image of Ford from that of a bare-bones, budget-focused manufacturer into a fashion-conscious and aspirational producer of dependable and affordable cars. Its follow-up was the larger Ford Cortina, swapping the fins and excess chrome for modernity, while augmenting the style and dependability with unparalleled pedigree. The likes of double world champion Jim Clark thrashing Lotus-powered Cortina touring cars around circuits up and down the nation. Within 8 years, Ford had embraced the production of cars you were desperate to be seen in, the Cortina finally usurping the Morris Minor's replacement, the 1100 range, in topping the sales charts for 1967. After a few more years with the 1100 on top, 1970 brought us the Mark III Cortina, complete with Coke bottle styling and a more grown-up attitude, and from 1972, a Ford would be the best-selling car in Britain for every single year through to 2020. This latest Cortina was also among the first cars produced by the new Ford of Europe, an operational merger between the former British and German subsidiaries, and as such the new car was sold on the continent, badged as the Ford Taunus. With their position now entrenched, Ford's dominance came not only from their image, but also their engineering. You see, while the 105e was simple, it was also well understood, and the early 1960s saw BMC, Morris's parent company, go radical, embracing front-wheel drive, transverse engines with sump-mounted gearboxes and scarcely believable float-on-fluid suspension. The likes of the Mini 1100 and 1800 were phenomenal to drive, but they were expensive to both buy and live with, and proved mechanically flaky beside the more rugged Blue Ovals. By the late 70s, however, there's an argument to be made that Uncle Henry grew complacent. You see, the Cortina dominated the British fleet market, selling in its millions to conservative fleet managers who didn't want radical. And 1975's Mark IV Cortina was just that. This boxy family saloon remained an acceptable, simple rear-drive car. It's also good looking, but that style isn't as exotic or as aspirational as its predecessors. In even worse news, the competition was now advancing at a serious rate of knots. Volkswagen launching the Passat, Roots, Simca, Chrysler, whatever, bringing us the Alpine. The principal feature of these two was their modern front drive layout, but in Britain at least, Ford really began shivering when General Motors got their act together in the form of the Vauxhall Cavalier. Known as the Opel Ascona in mainland Europe, this rear-drive family saloon began rapidly eating into the Cortina's market share, and when the Cavalier Mark II came along in 1981, in two was front-wheel drive and even a hatchback. For an ultra-conservative Britain, this was genuinely shocking stuff, and the Taunus-Cortina began languishing as a popular but elderly concept, meaning Ford were being twisted into joining the radicals. The Ford Sierra replaced the old Taunus and Cortina in September 1982, retaining fleet-friendly rear-wheel drive, but clothing it in the most radical shape this market segment had ever seen. Not only that, but Ford fitted it with a hatchback. And this wasn't something you chose, Ford thrust it upon you. This car before us, therefore, is the last of the old-school Retmobiles. A bar of dairy milk, but melted down and reformed into a twirl or a flake. The same, but somehow tastier. The first half of the 80s marked the apex of technology. Manufacturers settling into the accepted patterns of car design they still largely follow today. And though the Sierra remained rear-wheel drive, don't think Ford simply had the blinkers on. In 1977, they brought us the Fiesta, their first entry into the rising super mini market, and the first time they found it profitable to build a truly small car. As you'd expect, the Fiesta featured a transverse engine, front-wheel drive and a third door, paving the way for the end of the old rear-drive saloon-bodied Escort in 1980. In that year, the Mark III Escort bounded in with immediate popularity, yes, with front-wheel drive, but most notably with a hatchback. Now, the small family car market was noticeably more progressive than the Sierra's market, but nonetheless, this was Ford knocking on the door, its aeroback shape expected as a preview of the upcoming Cortina replacement. And as I've just alluded to, the hatchback is a natural consequence of chasing vastly improved aerodynamics. Minimising aerodynamic drag was suddenly becoming a focus again, 50 years after Tatra pioneered it and a decade after the oil crisis spooked the market. Famously, the Sierra was one of 3 German-designed cars to launch almost simultaneously, all pioneering a new age of aerodynamics. In the class above, the C3 Audi 100 achieved a drag coefficient of 0.3, while in the Escort class, the Mark II Volkswagen Golf debuted at 0.34. For reference, the original Golf was like a breeze block, scoring only 0.42, And the outgoing Cortina, well, that was up at 0.45. Naturally, the folks at Ford weren't aware of what their contemporaries were planning, but it's worth exploring as part of the world the Sierra was born into. There is a contrast, however, between the very acceptable, uncontroversial styles of the Audi and Golf next to the uber-modern, uncompromising Sierra. In fact, the Ford bears much more resemblance to its rakish forebears in this area, stemming from a concept that Pininfarina built in 1967 known as the Aerodynamica. This was never destined for production, and the radically beautiful body sat atop an Austin Morris 1800, itself, as we've mentioned, a seriously radical bit of kit. That's the 7th and final time I'm going to use that word. Promise. The Aerodynamica lay the foundations for the Citroën's GS and CX, the Alfa Sud and Lancia's Beta and Gamma all entering the market by 1976. Add in the more tenuous link of the Rover SD1 and we progress towards the Sierra. It's clear that the aeroback shape was nothing new, and I think it proves that the silhouette isn't what scared everyone in 1982. Instead, what got people's heads to turn was how unapologetic they were with the detailing. With the flush-fitting headlamps, the featureless front end, and the slabness of the sides, and the unique way the glasshouse was installed, the Sierra took everyone's breath away. It was like a concept car, yet here it was, replacing the most conservative of family saloons. So how did such a profound shift in philosophy come about? Well, you could mark this down as chasing the fashion, as I mentioned a moment ago. But as far as I can tell, it was a mix of both that and an inebriating dose of bravery. You see, Ford's vice president of design was a man named Ewe Barnson, and he'd headed Ford of Europe's design department all the way through the 1970s, meaning it was his decision to go conservative, boxy and straight-edged. But at the same time, he tentatively embraced fastback aero shapes in the form of the Mark II Capri and Mark III Escort. It seems to me, therefore, that he was eager not to ruffle any feathers, and it was only once he'd been in the job for a fair while, seeing other manufacturers catch up, many embracing aero shapes, that he finally decided to go mad. Of course, the politics of a huge car company means Barnson didn't have ultimate power, and the general concept of a true aeroback comes from Bob Lutz, at the very top of Ford, hence why such a departure seems to have sailed through the approvals process. But internal appetite doesn't always align with the public's appetite. So, to soften people's reactions to the Sierra, it was previewed at the 1981 Frankfurt Motor Show in the form of the totally uncompromising Probe 3. Probe. What a hilariously awful name. Aren't we all glad they never used that on a production car? Oh. Anyway, the final score for this XR4i is a drag coefficient of 0.32. Impressive, certainly, but not quite as low as the more conventional-looking Audi 100, confirming to me at least that there was a fair chunk of stylistic choice at play here. The Sierra's outwardly aerodynamic appearance wasn't therefore the result of engineering, but was a marketing tool instead, and if that was the case, then I'm afraid it didn't really work. Having suggested the Sierra was shocking, I have to repeat it again, as the average British consumer just couldn't level its appearance with the market it was supposed to occupy. It was all well and good for the likes of Citroën to style a car like this, but Fords were bought by anyone and everyone, and with huge stocks of Cortinas still available with huge discounts, the Sierra was very nearly a flop. This combination of an uncompromising shape and a mandatory hatchback body polarised, tending towards negative in people's initial reactions. With an equivalent Cavalier, you could have a traditional three-box shape, if you were scared of practicality, and you could have it in a silhouette that people didn't look puzzled at. It's often said in this regard that the situation forced Ford into launching the Orion, a saloon variant of the Escort, in 1983. But I don't overly think that's the case. Sure, they were anxious, but the Escort itself had switched to that aforementioned hatchback layout 3 years earlier in 1980. If they were starting from a standstill, surely they'd have just developed a saloon variant of the Sierra itself. Or maybe, just maybe, the Orion was pre-planned, just like all the small saloons that came around at a similar time. Regardless, the frenzy around the Sierra's launch was undoubtedly real, the underlying tone of our reaction nicely framed by Car Magazine's initial road test, titled "Sierra Shock, it really is a good car." My tuppence worth is that people grew weirdly comfortable with the Cortina. In the nameplate's 20-year life, it grew in terms of size and breadth and changed enormously in terms of style. In fact, I made a video a little while ago where I described Ford's European history as automotive blancmange. Fords were enormously successful. We bought them in their millions, but ask anyone what a Ford looked or felt like, and they couldn't answer you. They were always at the whim of style and circumstance, becoming incredibly successful, yes, but I feel that the resistance the Sierra initially felt was a bit of a combination of that ever-changing nature and our strange allegiance to the Cortina badge on the back. The result was Barnson banished from Ford. His understudy and creator of the Probe 3, Patrick Lecremont, was out as well, resurfacing to craft Renault's golden age of design in the 1990s. By 1986, Bob Lutz was gone too, forced out by a series of events, starting with the Sierra. But with that, the Sierra is held up as an icon of 1980s fashion, because of course, the Sierra didn't fail. The conditions that had Ford dealers mortally worried in October 1982 were either self-manufactured or were foreshadowing success. The huge stocks I mentioned of old Cortinas meant a private buyer could pay the same money for either a poverty-spec Sierra or a Cortina gear. Oversupply of the final Cortinas lasted well into 1983, creating the perfect conditions for an image of market rejection. Whatever resistance there was to the new styling and the hatchback shape subsided in the coming couple of years, and if we look to others for examples of a slow start, the Mini, back in 1959, struggled in its first year or so. And that turned out to be the best-selling British car of all time. We can sometimes just be slow to cotton on, while over in West Germany, the locally designed and built Sierra was taking the market by storm. Demand was enormously up on the old car, giving Ford a position in Europe they'd never have dreamed of 20-odd years earlier. So within a few years, and certainly with the facelifts and addition of a saloon, people did get used to the Sierra. And living for a full decade, this car lasted longer than any generation of Cortina before it, or Mondeo after it. And for me, that is a direct consequence of those stylistic choices, enabling the Sierra to remain contemporary and popular right up to the end. As I alluded to earlier, the brilliance of Vauxhall's Mark II Cavalier occasionally overtook the Sierra, what with its initial wider selection of body styles and more conservative styling, but in comparison, the Mark II Cavalier was looking ancient by 1988, and its replacement was so anonymous that Vauxhall never again matched Ford in this market segment. Even more so, the Austin Montego, built at the old Morris plant at Cowley, was taken for a failure. Its manufacturer forced into a total rethink for its successors. The issue of premium marques, Audi, BMW, Mercedes-Benz, etc., are a topic for a Mondeo video, but taken in its own context, The Sierra, with a rocky start, exceeded every single expectation. All in all, they produced around 2.7 million of them. But for me, viewing an early flat-nose example, I just don't gel with it. The sheer rakishness of the shape puts it in cahoots with the Rover SD1 and Citroën CX, but it lacks the sharpness of the Rover and the elegance of the Citroën, becoming fussy and ill-defined in equal measure. There's a reason it gained a gentle pejorative in being known as the jelly mould. Once the Sierra Sapphire, the saloon, came in, however, the car had matured into a less awkward, more dimensionally conventional, but better rounded car. The facelift took away the strange nose cone with the shut lines around the headlamps, allowing everything to flow so much better. In hatchback form, only improving its aerodynamic style, but in saloon form, creating a strangely stately family saloon out of something previously so unorthodox. Truly, in my books, the Sierra went from a distinctly ugly duckling into something I wouldn't be ashamed of. Regardless, it's taken us a fair while there to get through the styling, but that is the centre of the Sierra's shock and awe, for under the skin, we find exactly what the fleet manager ordered. But if they'd simply copied the old Cortina, the Sierra would have melted in the heat of the market. The front is classic Ford, held aloft by a set of McPherson struts. Now, depending on how you look at this, it was either an upgrade or a downgrade from its predecessor's double wishbones. But regardless, it certainly looked more modern, especially as Ford were the ones who really popularised their use. The rear, however, is all new, and that means independent rear suspension. It's coil sprung with semi-trailing arms, so it doesn't have the most precise wheel control, but the whole suspension, therefore, is rather similar to that used by the most iconic of 80s BMWs. And if you caught that video, then you'll know just how much I enjoyed both E21 and E30. The Sierra, however, turned out to be Ford's last rear-drive saloon in this class, and the independent rear suspension means it was just as complicated and expensive, if not more so, than an equivalent front-drive system. In service, it had the advantage of easier maintenance, but that was fading fast too. And in the end, the Sierra's retention of a rear-drive layout bore fruit mainly in motorsport. This XR4i feeds naturally into that, but let's not get ahead of ourselves, because first and foremost, this was a big family car that had to do big family car things. Unfortunately, I can't bring you my live driving impressions of this one, but I was fortunate enough to have a go, and big family car things is really my best way of describing it. The Sierra feels soft and cuddly. It's certainly not as firm as the aforementioned Bimmers, and that really dulls off the experience. On the contrary, I haven't ever driven an equivalent Cavalier or Montego, but I'm 100% sure that the Sierra acts more like those two. It doesn't feel like a machine to be hustled. Instead, you want to recline back into your sales rep driving position and let the jelly mould flow naturally down the road. Comfy and easy, certainly. A driver's car? Perhaps not. But what's also clear is that the Sierra feels very safe. It sits on the nose, reducing any chance of oversteer, and I reckon that's probably thanks to the big V6 that makes it move. Under the bonnet are essentially the same power units as seen in the old Taunus-Cortina, meaning 1300 to 2 litre overhead cam Pinto engines and a couple of Cologne V6s, 2.3 and 2.8 litres worth to be exact. And this being the range-topping XR4i, we're blessed with fuel injection and around 150 brake horsepower. Again, I'd love to be bringing you the noise this power unit produces, because for me, it's what makes this car. It's nothing modern, having been around since the early 1960s and retaining good old push rods, but it's the same engine that was concurrently found in the Capri 2.8 injection. It's punchy enough, certainly, and yes, it is a heavy old lump. But with the Sierra's seemingly relaxed demeanour, I feel its wave of torque nicely complements the wave of the chassis. Our memories of hot Sierras undoubtedly lead us to the Sierra RS Cosworth. The four-cylinder, enormously turbocharged Group A touring car that ripped up racing circuits and rally stages at the end of the 1980s. From a position of controversy and slow uptake, the Cosworth single-handedly made the Sierra cool. Unlike the Cavalier or Montego, the Cosworth's success made damn sure that nobody would ever see a Sierra as a sleepy family car. Its 200 brake horsepower and 150 mph pace, however, must be secondary to the chassis modifications, because if you'd listened to what I've just said, you'd be disappointed to lose 2 cylinders. Through losing that V6 soundtrack, the thing that, in my experience today, is the best part of this car's driving experience, it shows the XR4i in a very different light to its more famous and more successful successor. With that in mind, I can totally understand why, despite its older suspension, people hunting for something faster with the flair to match were more willing to go for a Capri injection. Now that's a very British trait. From 1984, Capris were only sold in the UK, not on the continent, as we were the only ones still with a taste for them. But this leads us directly to the rather short shelf life of the XR4i, because it wasn't exotic enough or capable enough to truly capture people's imaginations. Now, there hadn't been a fast forward in this class since the death of the old Lotus-Cortina some 13 years earlier, and with a changing environment, I think that points us to a little bit of the way into figuring out why this particular hot hatch wasn't all that successful. You see, Sierras were generally sold to fleets, and fleet managers may not have been all that enamoured by the XR4i's flashiness. Yes, all Sierras were controversially styled, but with the wing on the back and the red accents, it maybe wasn't an appropriate look for an employee. Add this to the fact that the Sierra had a more mature market than an Escort or Fiesta, and you can start to see why it didn't sell on the same page as the XR3 and XR2. Its replacement, therefore, had to stand out from the crowd, and it truly did with the debut of the Sierra XR4x4. With the same Cologne V6 but the addition of four-wheel drive, this new hot hatch, while still not setting the world alight, did about as well as Ford could expect from it until it was well and truly surpassed by the iconic Sierra RS Cosworth. The Ford Sierra, therefore, seems to have gone through 2 separate lives by the time it was a year old. From the high of an expected Cortina replacement to the low of what may have been market rejection. But the inherent strength and modernity of the design very quickly took it to a third life, one of such success and commonality that it led to mundanity. Mundanity in the sense that it was so socially acceptable to own one that the furore of its launch simply vanished away. But simultaneously, it also led a fourth life as one of the most deified and most successful performance and racing cars the world had ever seen. This Sierra XR4i, therefore, sits at the end of its second life, rather awkwardly, but at the end of its second life, just looking wistfully at its future fourth life. And with that, thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, then please do click like and subscribe to TwinCam as well. I'm forever indebted to my wonderful Patreon supporters, so if you'd like to support me that way, then please do follow the link in the description. And I'll have more videos coming along soon.